Well, g'day and welcome to the National Virtual Expo. My name is Rob Malicki and welcome to this session on the University of the Sunshine Coast. I'm super pumped for this one because this is a really interesting institution. But before we get started, I'm on Gadigal land today in Sydney, so I'm acknowledging the traditional custodians of this land on which I live and work. Now, in the next 20 minutes, I'm going to be talking through a whole bunch of different stuff. But before I get to that, firstly, if you're joining me live, thank you for being here, and you can ask any questions that you've got in the chat, whether you're on Instagram, Facebook, TikTok, or YouTube, or on the session hub. Drop your questions in the chat and I'll try to get to them by the end of this session. And if you're watching this on the replay, you can jump on the Choosing Your Uni Discord, where you can ask all of your questions, whether they're really broad and general, or whether they're specifically about you and the choice that you're trying to make. All those questions in the Choosing Your Discord we will absolutely respond to. And for parents, we have a Facebook community as well. All of the details for that stuff is in the session description down below. So in the next 20 minutes, we're going to be talking about the University of the Sunshine Coast. We're going to be talking about who would be well suited to studying there. And we're going to hear from some students about what they say it's like to study at UniSC. We're also going to look at its academic strengths. And I'm going to show you the ratings and the rankings for UniSC. Things like student satisfaction, graduate employment levels, graduate employment salaries as well. And we're going to try and get behind those figures, behind the marketing hype, to look at how those numbers are actually generated and whether or not they're actually relevant to you. My whole goal here is to help you build your shortlist of universities. And so right at the end of this session, I'm going to be telling you about other institutions that I would compare UniSC against if I were creating my university shortlist. So all of that's ahead, and I'm really looking forward to taking you through all of these details. But before we get started, I do want to acknowledge our major presenting sponsor, Southern Cross University, without whom this whole virtual expo wouldn't have been possible. So a quick word from Southern Cross University, and we're going to get right into it. Go. There's something unique about the University of the Sunshine Coast. It's the only university in Australia with campuses sitting across 3 interconnected UNESCO biosphere reserves. And it's right next to the World Heritage Gari Island. Now, that's not a marketing line, that's an actual scientific designation. And you know what? That actually shapes what the university teaches, what they research, and also a bit what it feels like to study there. But maybe let me save you some time and let's think about who this institution might not be suited to. And I'll be honest, this uni possibly isn't for you, probably isn't for you, if what you really want is like that bustling inner city experience with 60,000 students and a bazillion different opportunities. This is a university that's got 18,500 students, more or less, that are spread across 5 of its regional campuses across the Sunshine Coast and surrounds. It's smaller, it's chilled out, it's quieter, and to be honest, it's deliberately so. And I actually think it's one of the advantages that means it's going to really suit a certain type of student. This uni might also not be for you if like rankings and prestige are like super important to you. Because UniSC is a young university. It only started teaching in 1996, so it doesn't compete on those big global rankings the way that older research universities do. So look, if that's a deal breaker for you, you've got to know yourself, and that's fine. This is maybe not the institution for you. However, if you're drawn to health, environmental science, sports science, or education, you want practical experience baked into your degree from early on, and you want to live in a remarkable part of the world on Australia's Sunshine Coast, then this could absolutely be the institution for you. But before I give you my take on everything, why don't we hear from a student who's actually studied at the University of the Sunshine Coast and hear what they have to say about their experience. What's it like? What's the vibe like here on campus?
The vibe's awesome. I love being able to walk around and literally recognize people. That's something that, of course, I couldn't do when I first started my degree. I didn't know anyone. But it's something that over the semesters, as you meet people, as you hang out at the brasserie and get a bit of food and say, hey, how's it going? Can I sit here? You start to recognize people, and it is that community vibe that I touched on just before. So it's great to be able to meet people and make friends.
So that's one perspective, and of course everyone's experience at a university is going to be different. So if you've got specific questions about whether or not this institution might be the right one for you, drop them in the chat and I will absolutely get back to you and we'll make sure every question is answered. So let's talk about maybe 3 things that UniSC is really known for. And the first is that it's a health powerhouse for its size. Nursing, allied health, psychology, sport and exercise science, and even things like clinical trials, health runs through almost everything that this university does. Their Thompson Institute is a dedicated neuroscience and mental health research facility, which is unusual for a university of this size. They have clinical placement partnerships with the Sunshine Coast University Hospital, as well as plenty of other regional health providers across the sunny coast, which means you as a student will get hands-on experience in real clinical settings as a core part of your degree. Now, if you're interested in getting into health, it's an interesting field because a few years ago, the Australian government, under the former Liberal government, actually cut the fees for studying health and education quite substantially. So now it's the least expensive degree. These are the least expensive degrees, costing under $5,000 per year. And you can find out all about Australian government support for university studies, and the details are in the session description below. The session with the Australian government covers everything you need to know about HECS, about funding support, prac placements, which Services Australia will talk about. It's a really great session that I highly recommend everybody to go back and watch. The second thing that I think is absolutely a standout about the University of the Sunshine Coast is the lifestyle, of course. Yes, this is an academic institution, but the sunny coast is just such an amazing place to live. And the university sits between coastal ecosystems, hinterland forests, and of course, those UNESCO biosphere reserves that I mentioned. So for students studying environmental science, marine science, forestry, or conservation, this isn't just like background scenery, it's like literally your classroom. And honestly, the UniSC Forest Research Institute works on some really critical topics like sustainable timber, biosecurity, and conservation. Their marine and coastal science programs are absolutely awesome, using the local environment for field work in ways that city universities could only really dream about. So that's a serious advantage. Third, and this is not a small deal, it's a regional institution that's built for people who live and have grown up in the region. So it has 5 campuses. There's the main campus at Sippy Downs on the Sunshine Coast. There's Moreton Bay at Petrie, Caboolture, Fraser Coast at Hervey Bay, and of course Gympie. And what this means is that multi-campus network means that you can probably study closer to home without having to move down to Brisbane for uni, if that's you. It also means that if you're an international student coming to live in Australia, or you're moving from somewhere else in Australia, you've got quite a bit of choice about what kind of place you want to live in, all of them being in this magnificent corner of southeast Queensland. A lot of students at UniSC are first in family, or they're studying part-time, or they're balancing study with work and family. And so these campuses are designed around that reality. They're compact, they're walkable, they're modern, and they've got small class sizes in general, which means you're going to have a more intimate experience at this institution, be closer to your academics, and that has some serious advantages. Well, let's talk about the academic and research strengths of UniSC, and I'm going to walk you through these different areas. Firstly, the university has 5 academic schools. It has business and creative industries, education and tertiary access. We have health, law and society, and science, technology and engineering. Now, across those schools, there are more than 120 undergraduate degrees, undergraduate degrees or combined degrees. So most bachelor degrees, that's your first degree when you go to university, are 3 years long, and that's like standard here in Australia. However, there are some longer degrees for professional subjects like engineering or social work, and in some health fields as well. So where does this university punch above its weight? Where would you be thinking of going to UniSC as opposed to another institution? And let's think about those students that maybe you're not a local. Obviously, if you're local, it's your local choice. That makes that choice a bit easier for you. But there are some areas for which UniSC is definitely worth a look of actually moving into the region. Let's start with health and sports science. These for me are kind of like the headline acts. The School of Health covers nursing, paramedicine, occupational therapy, nutrition, counselling, social work, and sport and exercise science. The High Performance Sport Precinct on the Sunshine Coast is genuinely impressive. It's home to the Sunshine Coast Lightning netball team, and it features an Olympic standard 50-metre pool, a 25-metre pool, recovery facilities and an athletics track. So if you're serious about sports science, if you're an elite athlete interested in combining study with high performance training, this is literally one of the better setups in the country. Interestingly, a lot of those setups are in southeast Queensland. Griffith University is extremely strong. Bond has a great footprint, as does the University of Queensland. All of those institutions have exceptional options for elite athletes, and University of the Sunshine Coast sits amongst them. I briefly mentioned it before, the Thompson Institute is UniSC's flagship research facility for mental health and neuroscience. They're running projects on mental health, suicide prevention, and brain-based interventions. So for a university of this size, that's a significant commitment and also so important for society. They run clinical trials facilities on both the Sunshine Coast and Moreton Bay campuses, and that's on things like pharmaceutical, medical device trials, and that gives research students real exposure to how clinical research works in practice. If that's you, if that speaks to you, this is an absolutely awesome opportunity to be at the coal face of clinical research and development. Environmental and marine science is one of the other standout areas, and their research covers coastal ecosystems, climate impacts, conservation, and biosphere reserve management. So if you're interested in the environmental science issues, you might also want to check out some of our other keynotes. Got a great keynote from Maddie Massey, who's a science communicator, talking about building your dream career in the sciences. And we've also got a fascinating session with Ben Perrott, who's talking about how he transitioned into ecology in his mid-20s. And honestly, his story is absolutely incredible. I think you'll really love it. So check out that session too. Another area, sideways from just pure science and environment, is in forestry and agriculture. And these are areas that you won't find at most Australian universities. UniSC's Forest Research Institute does a lot of work on sustainable plantation forestry, on timber quality, on biosecurity, and on aquaculture. These are niche areas, but the job demand is seriously real, and the competition is thin because there's not as many graduates as other areas. So if you're interested in that environment space, but you want areas where employability is high, that area of forestry and agriculture is a really good one to investigate. On the teaching side of things, work integrated learning is embedded across a lot of programs. There are internships, practicums, clinical placements, field education, and industry projects embedded in across many degrees. This isn't something that the uni just kind of bolts on the end. It's really threaded through many degrees from really early on. So your nursing students go to hospitals, law students work in some of the legal community legal centres, and business students are doing industry placements with local employers. If you are first in family, or maybe you didn't get the ATAR that you're hoping for, or you're worried about that, UniSC has got a really fantastic pathway set up, enabling students from all sorts of backgrounds to get into uni. You don't need a 90 ATAR in order to get into this institution. And just as a general comment, the idea that you just have to get in on your ATAR is simply not true. Universities have got structured pathways, whether that's coming through vocational education, whether that's coming in and going through a college setup, so like a preparatory program, or whether you're taking a bit of time off and then coming back to uni as a mature age student. Basically, mature age essentially means if you've had a gap of a year or more after finishing school, you're mature age. So right, everything from your 18, 19-year-olds right through to 50, if that's your age group, you are all considered a mature age student. And I think this is just so important to note that UniSC is really focused on creating options for students to come in and study, and works hard across the regions to help more students to do so. Now, one thing that's worth noting is that the Moreton Bay campus at Petrie is relatively new. It only opened in 2020, and it's designated as a university hub for that fast-growing northern Brisbane corridor. There's a lot of new developments popping up there. So if you want to live in that booming region, you don't want to commute to Brisbane every day, this university campus genuinely changes the equation. And just a reminder, look, before I go on, that we've got heaps of amazing keynotes across like 90 different sessions as part of this virtual expo, and you can explore them all either live or on demand. Details are in the session catalogue down below, or going expo.choosingyouni.com/sessions. Everything you need to know to get you started with choosing a university is included as part of this virtual expo. Now, UniSC's national performance numbers tell an interesting story, and there's one satisfaction figure that puts them above almost every single one of the group of 8 universities. The GO8 is the coalition of Australia's leading research-intensive institutions. They're typically the most prestigious in Australia, sometimes called the Sandstones. So places like Uni of Melbourne, Uni of Sydney, and the University of New South Wales. And yet, on this particular metric, UniSC outperforms them. So all of this data I'm about to share you comes from a couple of different sources. The first is the QUILT dataset. It's the Australian government's national survey of students and employers. We're talking about hundreds of thousands of students respond to this, so the data is really reliable and it's independent. We've also got data here from the world rankings, from QS, global rankings, and from the Times Higher Education Group. So what does it all say? Well, firstly, UniSC on overall student satisfaction ranks impressively at 81.4%. More than 4 in 5 students are completely satisfied with their experience going to this university. That comes from the QUILT data. And that is really strong on a national level. For context, it's higher than every single group of 8 university. The Uni of Melbourne, typically Australia's #1 institution on a global scale, only gets 73.8% satisfaction. Uni of Sydney gets worse at 71.7%, Monash at 73%. So UniSC sits amongst the top tier nationally of how students are satisfied with their experience. Now, what that's driven by is small class sizes, accessibility to academics, and that campus feel that doesn't feel large and overwhelming. Students feel seen and they feel connected to the community, and that really counts. Now, teaching quality numbers follow a similar pattern, and regional universities often will outperform the bigger institutions on that measure, and UniSC is no exception. If you think by comparison, someone sitting in a lecture hall with 500 or 800 people feeling overwhelmed and not getting that personal support, of course that's a harder environment to feel like you're being supported than somewhere where you're like UniSC, where you've got smaller class sizes and better access to your academics. Let's talk about graduate employment now, because of course, for most people, you're going to uni and at the end, you're hoping for a job. And UniSC has got 78.2% of its graduates are finishing their degree, and within 4 months, they have full-time employment. That's a really solid number, and it's roughly in line with the national average. In terms of things like health, education, and STEM, the graduates at UniSC tend to do particularly well, and that's because of that regional employment aspect. In Southeast Queensland, there's high demand for teachers and nurses and engineers and the like. Likewise, when it comes to starting salaries, the median starting salary for UniSC graduates is $70,000, and that's competitive. It's much higher than the University of Melbourne at $65,000, and a huge institution in Melbourne like RMIT, which is like at $67,000. So it's basically like on a par or even better than some of the large metropolitan universities. Why? Well, because once again, the mix of students at UniSC tends to skew towards those professional degrees, applied sciences, health, education. And this is where starting salaries are solid and the demand for jobs is also really good. So let's have a look at the global rankings. And interestingly, UniSC doesn't end up in like the main ranking numbers on these major rankings like QS and the Times Higher Ed. It sits between 500 and 600th in the Times Higher Ed, and in Australia that actually puts it in the low to mid 30s out of 40 universities. So it's between like 30 and 35th in Australia out of 40 universities. So people might be worried about that number and say, oh my God, it's like one of the worst ranking institutions. But what I honestly think is that for a university that's only existed since 1996, and this institution is heavily focused on its region, I don't think that's of particular concern. Rankings heavily favour institutions that have a huge research output, so those group of 8 institutions, or institutions that have like international reputations and that are very well known. Those really influence the results. Now, that might be you. You might be looking for that prestigious institution that's turning out cutting edge research across all of its different academic areas. And if it is, honestly, I'd be looking at the University of Queensland, an amazing university just down the road in Brisbane, a couple of hours. The experience at the University of the Sunshine Coast is going to be very different. What that global number doesn't tell you is about the classroom experience. It doesn't tell you what your Tuesday morning tutorial will feel like or whether you'll get a job. So personally, I'm not as worried about those numbers as other people might be. Now, just a quick aside on that, if you want to compare every institution that you're interested in, and particularly in different fields of study, you can do that on the Choosing a Uni platform. We've deliberately built a super easy platform to use where literally, like ChatGPT, you can go in and say, tell me about Uni of the Sunshine Coast for these particular academic areas, and you'll get a result and answers that are configured around your interests and preferences and goals. It's not just who's got the most marketing dollars. So it's really worth jumping on there and just checking it out, asking any questions that you might have. Oh, and it's free. It takes like 30 seconds to sign up, not even. Now let me jump into what institutions I would consider UniSC against if I were trying to make my decision about where to study. Firstly, The most obvious comparison in my view is like a geographical one. And for me, Griffith University is probably the closest match in that Sunshine Coast, Gold Coast, Brisbane, Sunshine Coast, Brisbane, Gold Coast geographical area. Griffith, with its Gold Coast campus, has that similar feel in terms of coastal location and access to the coast, but it's bigger, it ranks higher globally, and it has a wider range of programs on offer. But it also has much larger class sizes, and people might feel you need to be a bit more proactive at Griffith to get what it is that you need. So if you're looking to choose between UniSC and Griffith, to me the question is really about scale and setting. Do you want a bigger institution with more options? Or do you want a smaller one where you're more likely to be known by your lecturers and by name? That's kind of the choice for me. We've got a whole session on Griffith University as part of the Expo. Find that in the session catalogue. Next, James Cook University. James Cook, further up the coast in northern Queensland, has presences in Townsville and in Cairns. But like UniSC, it's strong for environment, health science, and marine related disciplines. It has a similar strong graduate employment rate, and it's actually one of the highest in the country. So if what draws you to UniSC is some of those areas, but you're open to location, JCU is actually worth putting on the list. The other institution I'd put on the list in that regard, if you're looking for that coastal experience, is Southern Cross University. Of course, acknowledging that they are the major sponsor of this event, but without even thinking about that, Southern Cross University has presences in northern New South Wales and right down in Coolangatta, next to the Coolangatta Airport, next to Kira Beach. It also has really good strengths in health, environment, and marine. So if you're looking for those kind of disciplines, but you're also looking for an institution that's close to the coast and has a different sort of footprint, a different kind of lifestyle experience, then Southern Cross Uni, I think, is definitely worth a look as well. Now, finally, and I'm just going to throw a fairly random one in here, if you're thinking about regions and studying in a regional area, perhaps if you're coming from overseas or you're looking to move to a region and you're not fussed about being on the coast, then I reckon the University of New England in Armidale is one of Australia's most interesting options at the moment. It's obviously in a regional area, but it shares UniSC's focus on smaller communities, practical degrees, and serving those students who might not want to move into a big city. Their student satisfaction and their graduate employment numbers are both excellent. It's a very different location. You're in the inland, you're in the agricultural heart of Australia, one of them I should say. But the philosophy about studying there is fairly similar. Lots of people living on campus and a very chilled vibe. So I think it's a comparison most people wouldn't think of, but I think it's actually worth having a look at as well. And of course, we've got sessions on all of these as part of the National Virtual Expo. Details down below. So I now have a couple of minutes for questions, and what I want to do is to start off with some of the questions that came in advance. So we did put out a call for people to pre-submit their questions. So I'd like to get to these first, and then we'll see if we can get to some from the chat. UniSC's Sippy Downs campus is beautiful, but it's on the Sunshine Coast. Will employers in Brisbane or further afield still take my degree seriously? Absolutely. Look, every university in Australia has some incredible strengths, but the overall level of education in Australia is really, really high. And so what's important to realise with that is that no matter where you study, your degree on a national level has been recognised and has passed a minimum standard. So depending on what kind of degree you're doing and what kind of job you're looking to get into, the most important thing, of course, is having a degree from a good Australian university. UniSC is absolutely one of those. And behind that, the most important thing is everything else that you get involved with outside the classroom. And by that, I mean sport, clubs and societies, leadership opportunities like student representative councils or debating. It means doing things like having international study experience. It means working casually or part-time. And you know what? Here's a tip, great tip. Go and try and get a job on campus. Uni jobs pay incredibly well, like ridiculously well, but it's also an amazing addition to your resume and allows you to work alongside some of the people who might be teaching you. So if you're a science student, go and investigate volunteering in one of the environmental science laboratories or in one of the laboratories in clinical settings. They always need volunteers, and that volunteer work can turn into paid work, which is an amazing thing on a resume. One more, super quick. Okay, students just asking, this is a more general question. I got into my second choice, not my first. Should I accept it or wait and reapply? I would say, in most cases, you're better off to get started, to take that second choice, and then to look to transfer internally. You're already getting runs on the board. You're already able to take some of the same first year classes that you would otherwise be taking as part of the other degree. So go do that. Once you're taking those classes, you can then look to transfer internally. And even, let's say you applied for a completely different university, to apply to jump into that other university that you really wanted in the first place. You know what? It's not a barrier. It's an opportunity. It's an opportunity to try something you might not have expected, which, who knows, maybe you actually really discover the thing that lights you up as part of that second choice. I'm out of time. The questions that have come in, I'll be answering those in the Discord, so make sure you jump across. That's also free. Ask anything you want and you'll absolutely get a personal reply to all of your questions. Thank you for joining me on this session on the University of the Sunshine Coast. It's a fantastic option, and I'll see you in one of the other sessions at the National Virtual Expo. Have a great day. Well, I hope you got something out of this session, and if you have any questions at all, you can head to choosingyouruni.com and ask Lumen. Lumen is your AI guide who knows about every university, every pathway, every option that we've talked about throughout this virtual expo, and Lumen is available to talk to you 24/7, so it's ready when you are.